Welcome to the first episode of my new series called This Happened Here. In this series, I will be bringing you stories, the good and the bad of things that happened here in the USA and anywhere else in the world I find interesting enough to share. Today, I will be bringing you the story of how the sinks were formed. The sinks are located on the Old State Highway 73 Scenic, Gatlinburg, Tennessee 37738, just in case you want to visit. I do hope you enjoy this story as much as I've enjoyed researching and writing about it. Now here's the story. Hop on in the back seat. I'll tell you on the way. Colonel Wilson B. Townsend looked over at the beautiful place he called home, Elkmont, Tennessee. Settlers have been here since the 1840s when it was first called Little River. He loved this place. The air was clean and fresh, especially today because the rain was coming. He watched as the wind blew the trees and inhaled deeply, pulling in the smell of the trees. He could hear the river's rushing water rolling over the rocks and singing to him. The river, which the town was named after, gave him more than pleasure. It was also a major source of his income. This land supplied lumber to a large-scale logging enterprise, the Little River Lumber Company, which he started in 1900. He and a group of fellow Pennsylvanians had bought the 86,000 acres of land that ran along the river from Levi Trenton. Levi had inherited the land from his father, Robert Trenton, who was one of the first settlers in Elkmont. After Levi inherited the land, he soon had it surveyed and then had it divided into parts. He sold parts to hunters who found game in the mountains and sold the 86,000 to the colonel and his group. Colonel Wilson B. Townsend watched the rich folks who had taken the day trip board the train heading back to Knoxville. They had created the Elkmont Special, a 2.5-hour scenic tour that cost $1.90 and included stops in Maryville, Walland, Kinsel Springs, Townsend, Line Springs, Wonderland Park, and Elkmont, according to the Tennessee Museum. After having visited to look around and picnic for the day, some would stay at the Wonderland Hotel, but it was very exclusive, so most headed back home. The colonel stretched and inhaled deeply again. He could smell the rain. It was coming fast by the look of the dark approaching clouds, and it was going to be some time before it stopped. He waved to his neighbors and workers who were heading home after taking the day off to picnic on the campgrounds. They lived in homes close by. He was happy about the rain. Owning a busy sawmill company, he needed the water high so he could transport his logs downriver to his riverside logging site and then over to his company's sawmill in Toccolecchio Cove. He had built the railway that connected the two locations and business was booming. But for now he needs food and a good night's sleep, so he turned and went into his home, had supper, tidied himself, and went straight to bed. The next day, though it was pelting rain outside, it was business as usual. They had to take advantage of the high river and transport as many logs downriver to his business called the Little River Railroad and Lumber Company. They needed to do this before the water receded. He had great guys, and they were moving logs in truckloads and dumping them in the water, ignoring the rain. Days passed and everything was going great, but then one of the colonel's foremen came with some troubling news. The river was low, and the logs were piling up at the horseshoe curve a few miles down the river. The colonel hopped in his station wagon and drove to see what was happening. He was shocked to see hundreds of logs jammed at the horseshoe bend of the river. He called over his foremen and asked for suggestions. It was too dangerous for any of the workers to move these logs by hand. Plus, it was too heavy even with every hand on deck. Suddenly, the colonel had an idea. He had stored some dynamite from his time in the army for just an occasion like this. He would use the dynamite to blow away the rocks that were restricting the logs, thus freeing them to float down the river. Production was already on hold, and this was going to be the fastest and hopefully safest way to get things moving again. So he drove back to the warehouse, gathered all he needed to blow away the obstruction and free the logs. Then he headed back to the location. It took some time to set everything up, but everything was finally in place and all the workers were out of the blast zone. Then, boom! Rocks and parts of the trees were everywhere. But something else happened. The dynamite had blown a 30-foot hole in the riverbed. It connected the horseshoe, but now the dynamite had created a hole with a strong undertow and currents. It swirled around like water going down a sink's drain, thus dubbing it the Sinks. So the dynamite cleared the obstructions and the logs were floating again down the river. But little did he know at the time that his decision was later going to cause the death of over 60 people. After about 40 years of commercial logging and the Little River Lumber Company cutting over 560 million board feet of lumber of the Great Smoky Mountain, Little River Railroad and Lumber Company was closed. Visitors can still visit the Sinks in Townsend, Tennessee to see and enjoy its natural beauty, as well as the Elkmont Ghost Town where some of the former residents' homes are still standing. This is now tourist attraction and campground. Although you will find the Sinks beautiful and attractive, I urge you, please do not attempt to swim close to it. Okay, so now that we've come to the end of this story, I hope you liked it. If so, please give it a like and consider subscribing so that you can stay in the loop for the rest of the series. Up next is the Brushy Park State Penitentiary, the maximum security prison that once housed James Earl Ray, the man who was convicted for assassinating the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. I will tell the story of one of the most daring escapes in East Tennessee's history. So stay tuned, and I look forward to having you. Take care and goodbye.